introduce yourself and your background?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm a student of African Studies from Leiden University. And my main interest was actually information transfer in low literate societies. How is culture being proliferated? In my professional career, however, I became a grant manager. I've managed grant-making mechanisms or units in West Africa, Central Africa, and now in Tanzania. It was my last job. For about 10 years, I've been busy now here with business state relations, and more in general, non-state actors and state actors. It's not yet so very well developed interaction in this country. It needs a lot of attention, and the donors are funding that. And government is open to it. That is also quite an important factor. For 25 years, I've done this type of work, which means I've seen hundreds and hundreds of terms of reference or calls or inception reports and intermediate reports and final reports. And although I haven't commented all of them myself, I was often responsible for the quality, the end quality as the fund manager or project manager or country manager. So to me, it's not an unfamiliar setting to work in with the situation I work in right now.
Thank you. So do you have any particular past work experience that comes to mind when we're talking about Tanzania that you would like to refer to? Or
well, it's interesting to see a change in the administration and how that takes place in Tanzania. 5 years ago, we are now going into a second term of 5 years. Also, the change between the first term and the second term, we already noticed quite a shift in focus. I don't think the previous focus will no longer be there, and to bring in systems, more digital systems in the country, to clean up, some of the areas where cleaning up was needed, like corruption and drugs trade and all of that. And it's fascinating to see how the country goes through that. It's actually quite fast for such a setting. And I find that fascinating, and I decided to stick around a little bit longer to see what would happen and what the impact may be on a larger region, just not only Tanzania. I think the current decision-making sometimes attracts a lot of attention from the other African countries and developing countries in general. I must say that it is actually a pleasure to witness it, because Tanzania is not a very aggressive society. It's fairly polite in its dealings between the various factions and the various sections of society. And that is a great heritage I think the country has from the early decades of independence, and maybe it's also in the nature of the country, also during colonial times.
I think you were mentioning the current situation in Tanzania, which is very, I think, important, because we are just right after the national elections as well. I mean, would you like to elaborate a bit on that? I mean, what is the current situation?
What I noticed after the recent elections, and what we hoped for in the period before the elections, was that the focus of the government would move from, say, cleaning up of systems and bringing in new systems and training a lot of young people, newcomers into government, that the focus would also go to the business environment and the implementation and enforcement of the many measures that were collected in the famous document called Blueprint. When I was in Zanzibar very recently, I noticed that the president, Mwinyi Jr., was reaching out to the private sector, and his permanent secretary was preparing that meeting that he had in mind together with the private sector. So it was a serious endeavor. It was very open. People were very pleased and impressed with a sort of a change of atmosphere. And this, of course, many people were hoping for. The meeting took place past Saturday. And this morning I read in the newspapers that here on the mainland also there had been a meeting in the economic capital, Dar es Salaam, between the regional commissioner and the most important representatives from the business community. Interestingly, that meeting was stopped somewhere halfway because the regional commissioner thought that the presentations by the government staff were not good enough to continue. So his own side was criticized for not having prepared themselves properly, which is a total departure from a much more directive attitude that government had earlier on over the past 5 years and also in the longer past. It's a central plan economy, so the aspect of directiveness in how government communicates internally and also externally is strong. And that is something that is a behavioral change. So that comes very slowly. And of course, when we see something happening of this nature, that a regional commissioner actually tells its own staff or the people from government that he had invited to that meeting to prepare better, that is still directive, but it is internally and in a public event, which is quite a departure from what we've often seen before. And it gives hope that the dialogue will mature, because in the first 5 years it was very difficult, also on the private sector side. The institutions are not yet very well developed to bring substance to table and not case material only, but this good analytical material takes quite a bit of effort. And I think thanks to the BSPS program, the Business Sector Development Program or Support Program, and more specifically a program like BEST AC and BEST Dialogue, a lot of organizations have learned to come with better substance to the negotiating table, but still the institutions are not very strong. Financially, they're still in a very early stage. The economy is small, so the number of contributions and the size of contributions to make these organizations viable and strong is much less than in a country like Kenya or other developed countries or developing countries. So this is a process that, sorry, yeah, I think from both sides there is respect for that both sides still need to learn. And that is very, very encouraging.
Yes, and as you said,
Well, the country departed from it and quite some time ago. We may see a little bit of a rebound because you have to work with what you have. And that is in terms of skills, personnel, attitudinal matters are important here. So there may be a little bit of a rebound, but a central plan economy needs a very strong instituted government and instituted also subnationally. And that is quite a challenge, to have so many very well educated and very well linked entities of government, even for the least developed corners of the country. I think there have been interesting developments, that the appointments of the regional administrative secretaries and the regional commissioners, of course, and also other staff, specialized staff in the regional and district entities. We saw, especially at the regional level, quite an interesting change from maybe a slightly more political interest to a slightly more technical interest, the development of the region or the district in question. The centralizing of government income via digital systems to the central government, TRA, has had an impact on that. It took away a lot of the direct income from the regions and the districts, and it pushed the regions in, and they got a directive also from the president to develop the region. That is, in first instance, a responsibility of those who are there, the technical staff and the political leadership. And that has had an interesting impact. For us, it was so much easier to work with regional and district level authorities because they had that challenge to develop their own regions and thus generate more proper income for the region. So
yes,
that
that's
has
very
been,
interesting.
yeah, but to say the country adopts the Chinese model, I think it's the country tries to find its own way. It has a specific past. It has the luxury of many commodities and a reasonable climate, a reasonably reliable climate with which it can feed the sub-region beyond the country itself. Countries like Zimbabwe or Somalia are often in need of food aid, and this country can generate surplus. So the starting point is good, but I think at the moment one of the points that needs a lot of attention is skills development. The educational system has been lagging behind, one could argue. And it is maybe quite a challenge to catch up using traditional education, the face-to-face classroom education. Tanzania might benefit a lot from children going online and getting access to schooling via the internet. It's still early days, and I think the COVID crisis has maybe given a push to that in many parts of the world. And we will have to see whether that will have an impact on what will become available for Tanzania in order to catch up in skills development and general skills.
Yes.
And also service-focused skills and things like that.
What's very interesting in what you say is that it also tackles governance, because it's what you mentioned is also the reliability of the different services, which is interesting. About the business environment, because you're really specialized also in that question, do you think that there are I mean, also questions and opportunities to develop more entrepreneurship opportunities for young people, because and opportunities for also a service economy, a digital economy. I mean, what is, in your opinion, what are the main areas where and sectors which could give more opportunities to the young people?
Well, it's quite difficult to make a good statement on that, because the problem is so large that a lot of the activities that are being tried out are a drop on a red hot plate. The increase of job seekers and the perspective for them is quite worrisome. I think the new media do have quite a bit of potential for young people. There's a lot of young people that use Instagram and other softwares to trade, mostly trading, but to some extent also to bring their products that they manufacture to market. For the government, that is, I would think, I've never had a discussion about it with high-level leaders, but I think it's quite challenging for government to find a way how best to deal with it, so that you don't smother it in regulation. But at the same time, for a government, it's also important to gradually get this new section of the economy to feed the nation with tax revenues and to pay for other services. So that is still in an early stage, and my advice would be to let it grow, monitor it well, but let it grow, because it's sort of it needs a grace period.
Yes.
In order to see where it goes.
I have a question which is a bit maybe down to earth, but we see, for instance, in our small experience with some young entrepreneurs in the Arusha region, that the difficulty was to get an accreditation and also to even open a bank account, for which you need the accreditation. So that where you see that it's really difficult. I mean, not only for the skills, but also, I mean, they have a good internet connections, brilliant ideas, but what they need are really like some simple things, like even the authorization to, I mean, to work as independent, or to create an organization, and to even open a bank account, which is still difficult.
Yeah, I think it's not so easy to resolve that, because any measures that you take can also lead to abuse. People are very creative in that. So I'm not specialized enough to know how to go about it. There is experience in other countries, but it's all work in progress because it's so new to actually use the internet largely for your marketing and even for client contact in doing business. But that is a section of it all. I think the most difficult step is maybe not to get a bank account, but one of the most difficult steps is the premises. To have a location from where you work, where you can show your products, where people can come so that you can take their measurements if it is in fashion clothes or normal clothes or any product. It's maybe one of the biggest hurdles for people to start a business. The better educated, they know how to go about starting a business on the internet, and they know how to avoid the pitfalls, and they probably know ways to use somebody's bank account or to get a bank account. It is the not so well educated who may have golden hands or golden ideas, who have difficulty to find premises with water, security, electricity. And government has a lot of property standing idle. Partly that property dates back to the central plan economy early days. There is property that is much more recently becoming empty when government moved from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma. Maybe government can use some of that potential that you find everywhere in the country. Every city has large spaces and old buildings that are no longer used. So it can actually be decentralized as an experiment. And maybe just do it on a competitive basis, sort of an award type of thing, for people that are notably innovative and inventive, and that show to want to and be an entrepreneur in an area where government thinks there is room for new development. I've sounded out a few people, but it's only now after the elections and with a new ambitious regional commissioner for Dar es Salaam that such ideas may be tested. It was tested earlier on by CEDO, and it didn't work out fully because it was very difficult once people settle in a place to get them out. Because you want this to be a temporary thing for somebody to build up the business, but once the business is going, then you have to join the rest, who have to pay for premises and security and water and electricity. But it could help creating some kind of an atmosphere of creativeness among young people, to have such competitive access to premises and to create breeding grounds like we have seen in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands and Britain. Derelict ports, old factories were used by young people, and some of that has become a sizable percentage in its contribution to gross domestic produce. Like the design industry in the Netherlands is a multi-billion industry, and it's a lot of the dynamics came from people working in squatted derelict buildings and old factories because they couldn't pay rent.
It's creative,
So
creative industries, indeed.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think the creative industries are probably the better to start from. It would be much more difficult when you start with the VETA type of industries, but they would certainly also should be part of such experiments.
But there are many initiatives at the moment in the tourism industry. That's I mean, a sector where it's already happening. That there have been entrepreneurs, and that it worked quite well actually. So that's also interesting to see that it's let's say hit now by the situation.
But that is an industry that comes with hard foreign currency. And the far majority of youth will have to operate somewhere between the coin economy, the small bills economy, and the bank holding economy.
No, sure. There are many things, but if you look at a country like Greece, it's also a huge part of the economy. So it's not only, I mean, in the third world country. So that was very interesting. I think we moved away a little bit from the questions, but to come back to the final question. So how do you think that research and dialogue can be important in the current situation?
Yeah, research is, one could say research is always welcome, but I think applied research is what we need most. Decision making is done at a level where not everybody is sufficiently academically trained to take part in a discussion on the basis of typically academic research reports. So at Best Dialogue, we have strived to introduce research presentation that is accessible for not typically academically trained people, where the flow of thinking is not preceded by too much text on methodology and context, and because a lot of people know the context. What they need is good arguments on the basis of good evidence and a sound thought process that leads to conclusions and recommendations and indicators how to test whether recommendations work. So it's a much more pragmatic use of the academic circles. And the Highline network that we built with 6 universities, this UDBS, the business school of the Dar University, as the lead agent, it didn't get enough time, but I think it would be very welcome to have a lot of research done if it doesn't disappear in academic publications and on shelves. Yeah, there has to be really spot on for the question at stake. And if the question is very big, then it may need to be broken down in subsections in order to make it digestible and accessible. Because the university, like government itself, universities are paid with public funds, and as such, and maybe not the private universities, but the public universities are paid over public funds, and as such have a responsibility to be relevant for society. This has been a big struggle in Europe some 20, 30 years ago. And I think the position of the academia in the governance arena has improved. And there are more think tanks active. And a country like Tanzania has hardly any think tanks. And some would say there are none. but I don't think so. I think there's a number of think tanks, but they are bound by development funding. So there's always an agenda to adhere to. Some countries are a little bit better off. A country like Tanzania has a few very credible think tanks that are internationally respected. But Tanzania still produces a lot of research that is patient paper with which the researcher can maybe stuff the career perspectives, but not necessarily societal needs for well thought through thinking and advice. So a project like Pilot4 Dev and equally Best Dialogue, and also a new project that is starting up under EU funding, with a short pilot. All of these are very useful in order to get the universities out of their ivory tower and to get them to the field. And it looks like some of the universities are really interested and want to be at the forefront, want to play that role in the dialogue arena.
Yes, thank you. That's very, very interesting. I think we are reaching the end of the interview. I think it's been almost 25 minutes. Would you have any final message?
No, not in that sense. For Pilot4 Dev, I think it would be very interesting to start discussions with Milou van Molken and also her colleagues in whether this, let's say somewhere in March, April, to start discussions about the design of Pilot4 Dev. To what extent is the European Union interested in using a Pilot4 Dev type of intervention model for the promotion of independent think tank development? Because that is one of the, as a parliamentarian, it is very difficult to get access to very specific information that you need in order to make your point in the discussions in Parliament. You need think tanks that do a shadow budget. You need think tanks that look, say, after 3 months or after 6 months, and at the end of the fiscal year, how did government perform? At the moment, that is not yet there, and it is still a little bit hesitant. One has to be careful because there is not that tradition. The tradition comes from a point where it was said, you do the work, we'll do the thinking.
Yes.
That is where it started from. And in order to get to the point, I'm doing the work, can you do some thinking for me? That is quite a step.
Yes. That's a very...
I see that as a great experiment with this project.